Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bluddworth, and as you can see by the graphics, today's video is Dungeon Mastering Tips and Ideas That Worked. So when I say that these tips and ideas have worked, I'm talking obviously about at my own table. I have experienced over the many years of dungeon mastering or game mastering that some of these house rules really do work best for me at my table. Some of these homebrews that I've introduced, I've found that it improves the gameplay of any particular game. However, I do recognize that there is a difference between house rules and homebrew, and I'm going to explain that difference. I'm going to describe certain examples of house rules and homebrews and then that category that falls in between. And then I'm going to talk about how, how when you use them, there can be some negative consequences, particularly with homebrews, where you can use too many homebrews and it'll affect the game itself. So without further ado, I'm going to move to the definitions part of it. So I will talk about the definitions that I am using, and then I will give you examples of what I actually use or what I've heard of being used, and then kind of tie it all together and talk about some of the positives and the negative consequences that come with using homebrews. So, a house rule. A house rule is a written rule that you find in the Dungeon Master's Guide or the Game Master's Guide or a core rule book that tells the DM what they can use and here are your choices, or these are actual optional rules and they're clearly labeled as optional rules, and then you can choose for yourself whether or not you want to utilize those rules. All right, so a house rule is just selecting between those various options, and they're almost always clearly identified as optional rules, or they'll give you an options selection without actually labeling it options. And my first example is going to explain what that is. So I'll go over that when I start going over the different examples. The second grouping, homebrews. A homebrew is when you are introducing something to the rule book that didn't exist there already. All right, so you're not simply altering something, you're introducing something. Or in a homebrew, you are removing something that is going to alter the way that that game plays in a significant way. All right, so a homebrew versus a house rule. House rules you can see almost uniformly across any table that you can go to 1,000 tables, and you will have the reasonable expectation that some of these rules, because they came out of the Game Master's Guide, some of these rules may be employed. You're certainly within your rights to ask the GM what rule are we using for rolling up attributes, because that's a house rule that is right there in the Dungeon Master's Guide. You might not necessarily be able to approach the same Dungeon Master and say, well, I want to play a character, race, and class combination that doesn't exist according to the rules of the game. All right, that would be requesting a homebrew, and if the dungeon master or game master decides that they would allow it, then they're allowing for a homebrew to take place in their game that might not exist anywhere else. All right, so house rules are within the limits of what's considered rules as written, because they are written in there. Homebrews are not. Homebrews are solely something that has been introduced to the game. So by the Dungeon Master. So let me give you some examples of uh, house rule, and then some homebrews, and then some that I think fall in between the two. So I think the most prevalent house rule, or certainly the one that comes up first, is in the way that the players are going to roll the attributes for their characters. And so you're probably very familiar with this in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I'm certainly referring to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. They give you 5 different methods of rolling up attributes. And so I personally use roll 4d6, drop the lowest, and then allow the players to place those rolls into the attributes as they wish. That way they can pretty much determine whether or not a character class they're hoping to play, they're able to play because they're putting the prerequisite attribute into that slot. If they don't, the rules actually say that they can re-roll the character. All right, and so they just re-roll again until they get those minimum requirements that they need in order to play the character class. That's a house rule. It's written right there in the rule books. That's within rules is written, and you can go to any table and see one of those 5 different methods being used. All right, so can't be argued against. It's right there in the Dungeon Master's Guide. A homebrew. So I'm going to give you the one that I am personally using. All right, and I don't believe that this significantly changes the game system. It's certainly not breaking Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but I apply a different attribute modifier based on intelligence, particularly for magic users. So if a magic user has a 16 intelligence, he or she is going to get a +1 modifier to their spell memorization. All right, but that only applies to their being able to memorize a spell, not cast it. And a 16 intelligence would only allow them to memorize 1 additional first level spell. If they have a 17 intelligence, they can memorize up to an additional 2 spells. Can't cast them, but they can memorize up to 2 different spells. All right, but only first or second level. All right, and then at 18 is going to be a +3 modifier, and then that will allow a first level magic user with an 18 intelligence to memorize up to 4 different spells. The 1 spell that they normally would have, and then the 3 extra due to their extremely high intelligence. That doesn't mean that they can cast 4 spells a day. They can still only cast the 1 spell a day, but their mental capacity to memorize 4 first level spells is there. All right, or their ability as they get old, higher level, and they can start casting second level spells. Well, they can memorize up to 3 additional spells, ranging from first through second level, or eventually first through third level, and then it stops. All right, so this is only going to benefit the lower level magic users in giving them a little bit more versatility. So they're not going out with just 1 spell stored in their memory, ready to cast. They might have 2 spells or 3 spells, or at the maximum 4 spells that they've memorized. That's a homebrew. You might not see that at any other table if you went to 1,000 tables. All right, and it's only something that I do at my table. I don't ask or expect to see it at anyone else's table. All right, and I don't, again, believe that it really breaks the game. All right, it's just a benefit of very intelligent magic users at first, second, and third level. All right. Once they get above that, they're not able to memorize any spells higher than third, and that's only if they have that maximum 18 intelligence. The rules that fall in between house rules and homebrew are things such as maximum hit points at first level. So if you're familiar with many of the older systems, whether it be OD&D or first edition, AD&D, second edition AD&D, but mostly old school D&D. Both thieves and magic users only had a D4 for hit dice. So it was very reasonable to expect that you would have a magic user or a thief in your party that only had one hit point. All right, I know it's not the average, but it was certainly possible that they'd only have one hit point. And I think pretty much uniformly, uh, most DMs will allow for maximum hit points at first level. If you go to 100 tables, you'll probably see that at 70 of them. All right. So it's a fairly common um, rule change, and it doesn't break the system. So it's not quite house rules. It's not quite a homebrew, and it's certainly a safe kind of rule to implement within what you're doing. And like I said, in some cases, these in between or intermediate rule changes have worked their way into official editions later on. So the other one that I see very common is group initiative. So group initiative doesn't exist in first edition AD&D. It didn't exist in D&D, old school D&D either, or D&D basic. So, but group initiative is something that I hear about very often. It's used very often at individual game tables. To the point as does group initiative break the game? Absolutely not. All right. So those are the three major differences between these three different categories. Is does it conform to the rules like house rules do? Does it change the rules significantly like homebrews do? All right, but also does it break the game? And that's really the key factor. If your rule is breaking the game, then either your individual rule that you're implementing was too powerful, altered the game too much, or if you introduce so many home brews that you've now changed the very nature of playing the game. So home brews that can go too far. All right. If you eliminate hit points, all right, you're saying, all right, I'm not even going to use hit points as as a measure. My characters will, the characters in my group will never die. They can still fail in their roles and everything like that, but the most that can happen is that they can get knocked unconscious. So you're essentially removing death from the game. You're removing the idea that they could have injuries, serious injuries, permanent injuries, or get injured at all. That is a major rule that breaks the game. You will not see that at any other table. Most likely, if you went to 1,000 tables, 990 of them won't be using that, and it severely alters the game that you're actually playing. You won't recognize the game that you're supposed to be playing. You can do other things that will also break the system if you allow for example, like Tasha's Cauldron of many things, or whatever it's actually called, introduces the idea that you can swap racial traits. You can take the attribute modifiers from various races. You can, essentially remove all of the things that made each of the character races unique uh, compared to the others, and allowed it to be able to be switched up. I think that even though that is written in a in a rule book, all right. Now I know that fifth edition says that that's a supplement and it's not it's all optional, but if that were to be made at every table as a house rule or as an official rule that's written, then it would break the system. You would no longer have a recognizable Dungeons and Dragons game. All right, it would be something completely different. So homebrews can go too far. Uh, Later on editions can introduce things, whether it be in supplements. So supplements, even if they're official supplements, can actually go too far and alter the nature of the game that they're being suggested for. And pretty much a very different thing than house rules, because house rules can never go too far. Um, they might become unwieldy to keep track of all of them. All right, but you could choose to use every single optional rule in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you're not going to break Advanced Dungeons and Dragons because it includes those in its rule books. Uh, you might break your table in the way that you can actually run your table in a manageable way, but you're certainly not going to break the game itself. Uh, just like I said, some of those in between rules. If you decide I'm not going to allow bards in my game, or I'm not going to, allow for half elves and half orcs in my game, that is not such a significant change that you're going to break the game itself. All right, so that's just some ideas that I had about the differences between house rules and homebrew. And if you have anything else to add to that, please leave your questions and comments. If you disagree, I welcome disagreement. You can come in there. You can say, I think you're wrong about this. Or you can come in and say, hey, if you don't use every single rule, even though the house rule, the book actually says that these are optional, or you're making things optional that weren't meant to be optional. Again, I welcome disagreement. We can argue over the points of whether it's an official rule, a house rule. I think I win that argument because if it's written and it's listed as optional or could easily be made optional, then that's still within the spirit of the rules of the game. All right, and then as far as homebrews, if you have any homebrews that you found that really do work for you and work at your table, I'd love to hear about them so I can take a look at them and think about them, and and maybe we'll agree, and it'll be something that I might use in a different campaign than the one I'm currently running, but it might be something that I'll take a look at and say, you know what, I'll give it a try, and if it makes my job as a DM at the table a lot easier, and if the players really enjoy it, I see no problem with introducing it as long as it doesn't break the game. All right, so again, thanks for joining. Have a great rest of your weekend. I look forward to seeing you on the gaming screen uh, at any time coming up. I know I'm going back to work in about 2 weeks, so my time is going to really become limited in about 2 weeks' time. But I do look forward to seeing you on the gaming screen sometime soon. And if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. Really look forward to seeing additional comments in there, and and again, just keep on gaming, keep on enjoying, play the way that works best at your table. That's your primary purpose as a dungeon master, is for you to be able to manage your table and for your players to have fun while you're doing it. If you're doing those two things, it really doesn't matter what anything else is going on at anybody else's table. So focus on your game, your table, your players, and you will have a great time playing whatever tabletop RPG you're playing. Have a great day. Take care.